that there are three types of verbs in Spanish. AR verbs are those verbs that end in AR. ER verbs are verbs that end in ER. And IR verbs are verbs that end in IR. Now, when we say regular verbs, we mean the verbs that follow the rules. We've learned so far the rules for conjugating AR verbs. You know these. To conjugate an AR verb, you kick off the AR and you add the appropriate ending. The endings are here in green. O, as, a, amos, an. Now, if there's a verb that ends in AR but does not follow these rules, like the verb estar, because when we say yo estoy, it ends in an OY, we call that an irregular verb. So while there are many irregular verbs out there, like ser and tener, and we had to learn each of these conjugations individually, most verbs are regular. And so when we learn ER and IR verb endings today, you can assume that if you find a verb that ends in ER or ends in IR, you know how to conjugate it. It will follow these ER and IR verb rules unless we've learned that it is irregular, like tener. And then you would conjugate it the way that we learned in the past. Tengo, tienes, tiene, tenemos, tienen, etc. So let's get started. To conjugate ER verbs, you kick off the ER and you add the appropriate endings. ER verb endings are O, S, E, hemos, en. Alright, and we follow these in the same order as always. So the yo form goes with O, the tu form goes with es, the el, ella, usted form goes with e, the nosotros form goes with hemos, and the ellos, ustedes form goes with en. For example, yo como is I eat, tú comes is you eat, él come is he eats, nosotros comemos is we eat, and ellos comen is they eat. Do notice, the only difference between ER verbs and AR verbs is you use A's for AR verbs, where you use E's for ER verbs. Everything else is the same. So if you've got your AR verb endings down, you already know your ER verb endings. It's very simple. Now for IR verbs. To conjugate an IR verb, you drop off the IR and you add the appropriate ending. For IR verbs, the yo form goes with O, tu form goes with es, el, ella, usted form goes with e, the nosotros form goes with imos, and the ellos, ustedes form goes with en. For example, yo abro is I open, tú abres is you open, él abre is he opens, nosotros abrimos is we open, and ellos abren is they open. Hope you notice that the only difference between ER verb and IR verb endings are just that nosotros form. Everything else is exactly the same. O, S, E, N. But for the nosotros form, ER verbs end in hemos, and IR verbs end in imos. Again, we have hemos versus imos. Remember to pronounce those correctly. So to summarize, the only difference between AR verbs and ER verbs is that you use E's instead of A's for ER verbs. And the only difference between ER verbs and IR verbs is in the nosotros form. So let's practice. To say I eat the pizza, you would say yo como la pizza. To say you drink a lot of water, you would say tú bebes mucho agua. To say she shares the food, we would say ella comparte la comida. To say we read the books, we would say nosotros leemos los libros. To say they sell chocolate, we would say ellos venden chocolate. To say y'all write a lot in Spanish class, we would say ustedes escriben mucho en la clase de español. And finally, to say Antonio and I live in the house, we would say Antonio y yo vivimos en la casa. Because there we have an IR verb conjugated in the nosotros form, so it's vivimos.